Today, let's create this particular abstract loop. It's going to be perfectly looping and done in geometry nodes. So without any further waste of time, let's start the tutorial. In our default scene, we'll bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window, and we're going to change it from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor. Now we'll press this plus button to create a new geometry node tree, select the group input and press X to delete it. Now we'll press Shift A and search for a grid, which is essentially the plane on which we're going to be making these particular waves. If we plug the grid into the group output, we see we have a plane, but we want it to be much larger, so we'll increase the size to something like 20 meters by 20 meters on both the X and the Y axes. Now we need to deform the plane, so we require much more geometry. If you actually go to the wireframe view by pressing this button, you see we have only a few vertices available. So if we increase the vertex count all the way to something like 500, you see we have a very dense mesh, and that can be deformed really smoothly. So we're going to leave it as is. Now we'll press Shift A and search for a set position node, which will help us change or deform the actual mesh. We'll press Shift A and search for a wave texture, and essentially we're going to be using the principle of superposition of waves. That means you can add multiple waves together, and the amplitude of the final wave will simply be the summation of the individual amplitudes of the waves. So that way, instead of just getting a simple wave texture, we'll actually take a look at that so that we understand better. We'll change this from bands to rings, and we'll change it to have rings about the z-axis, and then let's just plug this into the offset. There are a few changes that we have to make. The first thing is that you can see it's moving towards the top right. So to fix that, we press Shift A and search for a vector math node, and we'll change it from add to multiply, and then we'll just multiply it by 0 on the X and the Y and give it some value on the Z. After that, we can also reduce the scale of the wave texture, so we'll reduce it down to maybe 0.2, and now we get these nice rings of waves. Now if we play around with the offset, you can see it just looks like a simple wave that's moving outward, which is fine in some situations, but I want to add one more layer of depth to this animation, and for that we're going to use superposition by taking this wave's texture, pressing Shift D to duplicate it, and then just dragging both of them to the side and pressing Shift A and searching for a vector math set as add itself, and plug that in between the wave texture and the multiply, and plug the color from the second wave texture into the second socket of the add texture. Now we have to actually play around with the scale and the phase offsets. So if we change this scale to be something like 0.1, essentially different from the first wave's texture, and then we'll actually play around with the offset when we animate it. So let's animate it right now by setting all of the defaults. So let's go to our output properties, change the frame rate to 30 frames per second and frame as 150 so that it's a 5-second long animation. Change the output folder to wherever you want it to be. File format is going to be FFmpeg video, and an encoding has to be changed from Troska to MPEG-4, and an output quality of perceptively lossless. Of course, you can use whichever ones you prefer over here. Then we'll change the phase offset to 0 on both the wave textures, and on frame 0, which means we'll have to press the back arrow to go to frame 0, we'll just hover over the phase offset and tap I, and we'll do that for this first wave texture as well. Look, insert 2 keyframes. Now we'll go to frame 150, and we'll change the first phase offset to an even multiple of pi. So let's say 2 star pi, and then press I, and then the second wave texture will make double of that. So we'll make it 4 star pi. So essentially any even multiple of pi will loop it perfectly, and this way we can hover over it and tap I, and then we have to shift select both the wave textures, come down to the timeline and press T linear, and that way we get a perfect loop. And you can actually see the pulsating effect, but right now it's going way too slow, so we'll just decrease the grid vertices to help make it faster. And now when we play it back, you can see how there's a little pulsating effect to the wave as well as the waves get added in. It's a bit more than just a basic wave texture. These waves are actually increasing in size. You see this particular wave is decreasing, now it's increasing again and decreasing, and that's because the second wave texture is actually passing through the first wave texture and affecting the first wave's texture like that. Now, before I actually render this, I will definitely increase the vertices back up to 500, but for the rest of the preview, we'll keep it down at 100 itself. Now, let's go ahead and create a top version of this as well by pressing Shift A and searching for a joint geometry so that we can have both the floor and the ceiling, and then press Shift A and search for a transform geometry node. Just keep it outside the link and plug this geometry into the geometry, and this one from here into the joint geometry. Now we can translate it on the z-axis by maybe 5 units, and that way you get a second copy that moves on top. And then we want this to be a mirror image of the bottom. Right now, if you look at it, you can clearly tell that this should also be viewed from on top. The normals are also flipped, and to fix all of that, all we have to do is scale it on the z-axis by -1, and that way it inverts itself, and I think it just reflects the bottom much better and it looks better in this particular orientation. Next up, we have to add some spheres which are going to randomly move up and down, and we're going to use techniques that we've done in multiple videos before by pressing Shift A and searching for a cube, and then plugging this cube cube into the joint geometry, and then we have to position the cube in the center. So we can just press Shift A and search for a set position node or a transform geometry node itself, because we will be scaling it later on, which you could do directly from here, but using this transform geometry also makes sense, so we'll use that itself. Now we'll move it on the z-axis by 2.5, which is halfway to the top, and then we can go ahead and make it a lot wider. So we'll change the scale on the x and the y to something like 5 or even 15, after which we can scale it a little bit on the z-axis. So let's change that scale to maybe 2, and this is all right. Now let's convert this into a volume. So press Shift and search for a mesh to volume node, plug that in after the transform geometry, then change the voxel amount down to like 4 so that it's faster to render. And remember, when you change this voxel amount and stuff, the actual shape changes, so be sure to play around with the scaling to get exactly what you want. I'm going to reduce my interior bandwidth and exterior bandwidth to 0, and then press Shift A and search for a distribute points in volume node, plug that in after the mesh to volume, and now we'll reduce the density down to maybe 0.1, and I still see a lot of points coming outside, so I'm just going to go ahead and increase the voxel amount to 5, and I think I'll go with a scale of 0.5 on the z-axis and a voxel amount of 12. So now we have our points, and I want to instance some spheres onto the points. So I'll press Shift A and search for an instance on points node, plug that in after the distribute points in volume, and then for the instance I'll search for an icosphere and I'll plug that into the instance. Now the icospheres are a bit too large, so I'm going to increase the subdivisions to 3. Of course, before rendering it out, I'll increase it even more, and I'll change the radius to 0.2, after which I'll search for a random value node, change the max value to maybe 5 or 3, and then plug that into the scale. Now that we have random sized spheres, we want to move these spheres up and down randomly. So to do that, we use a set position node, and we'll just take all of this, shift it to the back, and continue. So press Shift A, search for a set position, plug that in. Now for the offset, press Shift A and search for a noise texture. Of course, we're going to be using the same technique that we've done in multiple videos before, so do check them all out. Press Shift D, change both of them to 4D, and then search for a mix color node, and then plug this color into the first socket, this color into the second socket, go back to frame 0, hover over the W value and tap I, change the factor down to 0, tap I, and then change this W value to maybe 1 and tap I, then go to frame 150, change this W value to 0, tap I, change the factor to 1, tap I, and change this W value to the negative of the W value that we kept, which was +1, so we have to make this -1, and press I. Now shift select all of them, come down here, T linear. Now this result is random noise on all 3 of the axes. We want it only on the z-axis, so we're going to use the same technique that we just used a while ago. Hopefully you can figure that out by yourselves, which is adding a vector math, changing it from add to multiply, and multiplying it by 0 on all the axes except for the z-axis. Apart from that, remember, noise textures always shift everything by 0.5 on average because it's centered around 0.5. We have to bring that back by searching for another vector math node, changing it from add to subtract, and subtracting 0.5. Of course, you could add -5 as well. Now this vector we can plug into the offset of the set position, and now if you play the animation, you should be able to see these particular spheres move randomly up and down. Right now the motion is very minimal, so to increase that, we're just going to change this Z value to maybe 5, and that way the motion becomes 5 times as strong. So that's something nice enough, but I still feel like there's too many micro motions happening. So to fix that, we can change the scale on the noise textures. I'll make it 1 and 1, or maybe 0.5 and 0.5. So make sure that whatever changes you make on one, you make to the other, and you could change these manually or just use a value node and change them over here so that you don't have to keep changing it on both of them when you play around. Now that you have this set up, to actually see the final speed at which all of these objects are moving, you can change this playback down here from play every frame to frame dropping, and that way you'll get a realistic idea of the speed of the waves and the speed of the motion of the spheres. Now I feel like I need the spheres to be a little faster, so I'm going to increase this scale to 1, and now you can see what the motion looks like. Now that looks well and good, but we have to of course set shade smooth and the materials. So we'll come back to our original tree, press Shift A and search for a set material node, plug that in just before this joint geometry. Now this is for all the spheres that we just created, so let's go to the material properties here, come up here and change the default materials name from material to spheres, then give that the material in this set material node. Now move this group output a bit to the side, search for a set shade smooth node, plug that in after the joint geometry because we want everything to be set to shade smooth, and then for both of these we need the same material, which is going to be another material, so let's search for a set material node, plug that in over here, press this plus button to create a new material slot, new to create a new material, and we'll call this waves, and now we'll change this to waves, and we'll press Shift D and plug that in over here. And with that, we're done with the geometry node section. Now let's start the actual texturing and the world properties. So the first thing that we should do is set up the scene. So to set up the scene, we'll select our light, press delete to remove it because we don't need it. Then we'll select our camera, press Alt G, Alt R to clear location and rotation, RX 90 to rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees, GZ 2.5 to move it up by 2.5 units, and then GY and just drag it back. Now we'll press 0 on our numpad to go into the camera view, and this is what we get. If we don't like it, we can always press GY and just zoom in or zoom out according to what you want. I think in this situation, I'm just gonna leave it at some position like this, and I don't want to see anything outside my camera view, so I'll come down to my object data properties, go to viewport display and change passport out all the way to 1. Apart from that, I'll switch off overlays, and then I'll go to my render properties and set all of these defaults, which is going to be switching on ambient occlusion and screen space reflections. For the ambient occlusion, I'm going to increase the distance all the way to 10, and I'm going to increase the factor to 1.5. After that, I'll change to rendered view so that we can actually see the changes and the ambient occlusion and everything like that. Finally, we'll go to our world background and just increase the color from this dark gray all the way to a white, and this is what we have. Now, I feel like increasing the ambient occlusion, so I'm going to increase it to a distance of 20 meters, and that way we get this really nice ambient occlusion, and that looks really cool by itself, and I wouldn't actually mind just rendering this out, but we have to add in some types of color, so let's go ahead and do that. We'll change the geometry node editor to the shader editor, and if we have the geometry node object selected, we should get the materials to pop up over here, and to switch between materials, we have to go to our material tab and we can select them over here. First off, we'll choose the waves, and we'll just increase the metallicness all the way to 1, and we'll increase the roughness as well all the way to 1, and that'll also amplify the ambient occlusion effect, but we'll change our base color to the brightest white there is and give it a tiny bluish hue. Then we'll select our spheres material over here, and we'll increase the white all the way to white and then give it the same bluish tint, but this time we're going to keep the metallic all the way at 0 and increase the roughness all the way to 1. Then for the actual background, you could simply change the color or do things like that, but for now I'll just press Shift A and search for a cylinder, press GZ 2.5, then scale it up till it comes outside our camera view, and just bring it to the point that it just comes out of the camera view, not too far off. And then click on object, shade smooth, give it a new material and make it a nice bluish color. It could be a dark bluish color as well. You can play around with the saturation and just make it exactly the type that you want. And the reason we're keeping it fairly close is so that there's ambient occlusion from the ceiling and the floor also coming onto it, which produces really nice shadows, and I think that looks nice. So that's there. However, last thing is you can choose your camera, reduce the focal length to bring it out, and you get different animations according to the focal length that you choose. If you give it something like 18, you can clearly see what type of an animation it is. I'm actually going to select my cylinder and make it completely metallic as well. Maybe increase the base color a bit, and yeah, you could get this sort of an animation that happens solely in the center region. You could always zoom in with your camera after this as well, which keeps that fisheye effect, but for now I think I'll go with a focal length of 35 instead of the default 50, and that could be your final render based on what your preferences are. However, I feel like another thing is left to do, which is going to our render properties, going all the way down to color management and changing the view transform from filmic to standard, and that actually makes the whites into a real white. We can increase the look to high contrast as well, and just play around with these till you get the exact look that you want. So with those final few changes based on your own preferences, once you're ready, all you have to do is press render animation. Hopefully this video was simple, and yet you learned how to implement and combine multiple techniques to create something abstract that loops, which you can use in the background for various videos, as b-roll, or so on and so forth, in any way as long as you use your creativity and imagination. If you have any questions, comments, queries, or requests, comment them down below. I will respond to as many as I can for as long as I can, and thank you so much for watching, because the watch time really helps me. I release videos every single day, so I have multiple videos on my channel that you would definitely enjoy watching. So until the next video comes out tomorrow, keep creating and stay creative.